Perhaps it was doomed from the start when, in 1999, violent anti-globalization protesters staged what they called the Battle of Seattle and forced World Trade Organization officials who were meeting there to move their entire conference half a world away to Doha, Qatar. Now it's been 6 years, and those talks, which came to be called the Doha Round, and which were intended to break down or at least lower trade barriers between rich and poor nations, those talks have ended in stalemate. The barriers still stand. On one side, the rich countries that heavily subsidize their agriculture, you know who they are, the likes of Europe, Japan, the United States. And on the other side, developing countries that are seeking greater access to the global market, Brazil and India to name a few, known as the Group of 20. They represent about 2/3 of the world's total farm output. So what does Doha tell us? Are these efforts to increase trade between rich and poor nations doomed? Or can we figure out, after all, a set of rules to level the playing field? And what does this all mean for globalization as we know it? All this coming up next on Great Decisions 2007.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.
And now from our New York studios, here is John Donvan.
I'm John Donvan of ABC News, and welcome to Great Decisions. Joining us today to discuss the future of global trade are Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner of economics and professor of economics at Columbia University, also author of Making Globalization Work. Welcome to the program. And Daniel Dresner, who is professor of international politics at Tufts University and author of U.S. Trade Strategy, Free versus Fair. He also authors the weblog DanielDresner.com, which I can say I've looked at, and it is fun as well as informative. Doha Round is not a fun term in the sense that you hear the phrase Doha Round, and what does that refer to? So first of all, to make it simple, Doha is a place in the country of Qatar where a series of meetings took place over several years to try, Joe, to accomplish what?
Well, after Seattle that you mentioned, they needed a place that was a little quieter, right, and a place where protesters would be less at home. And so they chose Doha as a place to have these negotiations. The developing countries said, if we're going to come back to the table and negotiate, we want the negotiations to be around a set of issues that we are concerned about. In the last round, the previous round called the Uruguay round that had ended in 1994, the agreement was so unfair that the poorest countries of the world were actually worse off. They felt pressure to sign this, even though they were worse off. And they said, you know, we don't want this to happen. The advanced industrial countries, Europe, the United States, Japan, said, okay, we'll call this a development round to redress these imbalances.
And they meant it.
I don't know.
No.
They meant to try to get them into the negotiation. That's clear.
Well, Daniel, who's at these meetings?
The trade negotiators for approximately 150 countries.
I'm sorry, but how do you have a meeting with 150 countries?
Well, the answer is you generally don't. I mean, although ostensibly the ministerial conference is a way in which all these countries can get together, in point of fact, most of the negotiations take place in what are often called green rooms, this sort of term of art, which means, you know, a small room where you get the key decision makers. In the past, up to Uruguay, it used to be just the United States, the European Union, Japan, and Canada. What's changed with the Doha round is that the green room has expanded a little bit. You now have the so-called Group of 20 nations, as you mentioned in your introduction. So China, India, Brazil, South Africa, even, you know, in some cases the West African states have a seat at the bargaining table. The other thing that's changed, and, you know, Seattle was sort of the turning point here, is that you also have at these ministerials a whole array and panoply of non-governmental organizations, you know, counter-globalization groups, a variety of groups that want to, on the margins, somehow influence what's going on inside.
These are the Oxfams and groups like this.
Oxfam, Save the Children, you know, even people like Jose Bové from France, you know, to go to one extreme, and on another extreme, you know, groups like Transparency International or the German Marshall Fund.
So go ahead.
It's not just these NGOs and other groups. There are also a lot of media, and these are big media events. And that's important because what happened in the past is everything was done quietly behind the doors. The deal was finished and then presented. And the fact that the countries were worse off, they had to either accept it or reject it. No room for negotiations at that point. It was done between the major powers. Now, with the media covering it, they can immediately transmit the tentative where the negotiations are going back to the capitals in the developing countries. And the good news, over the last 15 years, there are a lot more democracies.
Right.
And they bring it back and they say, you're going to make us worse off again, like you did in 1993-94? We don't want that. And, of course, they want to get reelected. And that's changed the dynamics of the negotiations enormously.
I was just about to use that term. The very dynamics of this seem to be part of the heart of the matter of what we're talking about. Who gets to participate and the way they get to participate seems to be, in itself, almost a concession.
And it's not so much concessions, it's a concession to reality, which is, when the prior rounds of the WTO and the GATT before it were negotiated, those four, parties were the largest economies in the world. Now you're in a world where China, India, the BRICS, it's often referred to as BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are significant players in the global economy, and they can't be ignored anymore. And as a result, they now have a veto to some extent over what's going to go forward.
Another aspect of that was that in the discussions leading up to the Uruguay Round Agreement in 1994, there was supposed to be what was called a grand bargain. For 50 years, trade negotiations had focused around manufacturing. Manufacturing was what Europe and the United States were really concerned about, opening up markets to their goods, and our comparative advantage, what we sold, were manufacturing goods. There's been a great change in the structure of the American economy, and to a less extent in the European economy. Right now, manufacturing is only 10, 11% of employment and output. So our interest no longer is in manufacturing. I mean, in some sense, we had opened up the market for China. So the issues today that we are concerned about are services and intellectual property. The grand bargain was, we'll put those issues, they agreed to let those issues be on the table. And then there were other issues that the developing countries were concerned about, agriculture and textiles, which are goods that less developed countries can produce more easily. The problem was, in the last round, the developed countries got what they wanted. They got services but only skilled services like financial services, not maritime services, the services that are concerned to developing countries, or construction services. They got intellectual property in ways that resulted in less access to generic medicines, had the result of killing thousands of people. But the concerns of the developing countries, agriculture and textiles, were postponed.
Well, if we can extract this a little bit from the specifics of what's happened in the last two rounds, in a sort of broad way, lay out for me, Daniel, and then Joe, what broadly is at issue in a trade negotiation, and why does that actually connect, and it does, to the way people end up living their lives?
Trade's important, not just to the global economy, but domestic economies. I mean, even in the United States, the Institute for International Economics did a calculation to see what the benefits were from freer trade from 1945 on, and they estimated that, on average, every year, an extra $800 billion to $1.4 trillion were added to the U.S. economy. That's every year, to the extent from from trade liberalization. In theory, in economic theory, trade liberalization generates greater competition, greater productivity. It makes economies more efficient on the whole. So to some extent, it's seen to be as a win-win game between countries. The problem is that sometimes it's not a win-win game within countries. Broadly put, you're in a situation right now where the United States and the developed countries are, well endowed with capital. They're very good at, high-level, high-skilled jobs. On the other hand, the comparative advantage of developing countries is labor, relatively cheap labor. So as a result, if you have trade liberalization, what's going to happen is that the owners of capital in the developed countries are going to be better off, and the owners of labor in the developing world are going to be made better off. The question is, who loses from this? In the United States and the developed countries, it's unions that lose from this, or to some extent, workers face a threat in terms of potential job loss and wage compression. In the developing world, it's local owners of capital that face a fear of competition from multinational corporations and other more efficient producers. So as a result, whenever you try to liberalize, you've got domestic interest groups, strongly entrenched domestic interest groups in all countries bitterly fighting this, which is one of the reasons why, for example, on agriculture is one of the least liberalized elements of the global trade system. The reason is because agriculture is a politically powerful force in every country in the world.
Because of the tradition of the farmer working the land.
Because of the tradition of the farmer
and because
working
of the
the land.
numbers of people doing it.
Right. Or in the United States, farm groups, for example, farm states are heavily overrepresented in the Senate and in the House. And as a result, trying to get a trade agreement that, let's say, allows more sugar imports into the United States is a fantastically tricky business to engage in.
It's actually, it's represented as because of the massive American farmers, but that's actually not what is really going on. No. For instance, one of the really important issues has been cotton. Cotton is millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa live on, depend on for their livelihood on cotton. In the United States, it's only 25,000 rich, mainly corporate farms. So we're not talking about a small family farm. We're talking about corporate welfare here.
But the poster child for the corporation that's a farmer is the small family farmer.
Exactly.
Guy
It's
in
the
a tractor
poster
with the straw in his mouth.
Exactly.
It's very romantic.
It's very romantic, but it's not the reality. The reality is old-fashioned corruption, if you want to call it that. Big campaign contributions, buying $3 to $4 billion, in the case of cotton alone, $3 to $4 billion that go to 25,000 farmers. Most of it goes to only about 15% of these numbers. Case of rice, there's only 10,000 rice farmers that are dividing $1 billion. Seldom have so much benefits gone to so few and done so much damage to so many. And it exposes the hypocrisy of U.S. rhetoric. We say we're in favor of free trade, but we're not. It's not a free trade.
This is not just an American hypocrisy. I think that what both you and Daniel are saying is that, in theory, everyone, unless they're a communist, believes in the notion of free trade, that everyone is going to benefit in the long run, and that in implementation, everybody's trying to protect his own backyard, and that's what essentially the stalling out of Doha is about.
That's right. But there is a little bit of a difference that I want to point out, and this is related to what Dan said. It's not just special interests. On one side, you do have special interest, the special interest of the cotton, sugar, a number of these very narrow rice farmers. On the other side, you do have unskilled workers in the United States will have their wages driven down. This is not a special interest. This is a broad body of the population. Mm-hmm. The theory says that the winners could compensate the losers. It doesn't say that they will. And too often, globalization is being used as an excuse to even take away some of the social protections they've already had.
So even the theory suggests that there are going to be winners and losers as opposed to everyone wins.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, I would add two things to Joe. First, if you talk about agricultural policy, you're right. Everyone does it. If the U.S. commits a venal sin with its agricultural protections and subsidies, I would argue the EU commits a mortal sin when it, if you take a look at how it runs its common agricultural policy, which is almost twice as bad in terms of sort of subsidies as a percentage of income that farmers receive. So it's a real problem in Europe and, even more in Japan and Norway as well. So it's not just the U.S. that does this.
Very much so.
The other thing that you have to consider is that it's true that trade can sometimes within a country make some people worse off and some people better off. But part of the problem here is perception. For example, there's a lot of talk about how Walmart potentially somehow impoverishes, working class Americans because, it forces production to move to China, for example. And yet you can also have groups like the Center for American Progress, which did a study showing that, in fact, even if you consider the employment effect, most lower-wage Americans are much better off by Walmart because the goods that they buy in retail outlets, not just Walmart, but retail goods are so much cheaper. But the problem is that when you think about trade, when Americans think about trade, they don't think necessarily about the effect on consumer prices. They think about the effect on jobs, even though the effect on jobs is only part of the story.
But it is still the case that trade liberalization will lead to a lowering of real wages in the advanced industrial countries of unskilled workers.
Because of the way the cards were stacked earlier.
Exactly. Or the way to think about it is think about what a fully integrated economy, well-functioning, would look like? We're nowhere near that, but what would it look like? It would mean unskilled workers in China, India, and the United States.
All making the same wage.
Same wage. That's what the theory predicts. And that means...
You get a look askance on that one.
Well, partially it's because even if you have a perfectly functioning trade system, there are still things like transportation costs and communication costs that provide advantages for lower skilled workers, even based in the United States. You can't outsource, for example, a plumber, or you can't outsource an electrician who's going to come to your home.
So we're not going to be fully equalized. But the point is, the theory is very clear that it's a pressure towards equalization.
Absolutely, that's true.
And that's part of the tension. I want to make clear, this is not a special interest group. This is a broad body of what would be true even with any special interest. The problem is that right now you have two groups in the advanced industrial countries, those who are genuinely hurt, and the special interest groups who want to maintain their privileges. And they are making it very difficult to go ahead with the progress in liberalization, which, as Dan says, has the potential of raising living standards.
There's actually a third group as well, and I think this is the one that's actually driving why, in the U.S. there's increasing hostility in terms of public opinion polls about trade, which is the Program for International Policy Attitudes conducted a poll about, attitudes towards trade in 1999. The bread and butter group that generally supports trade in the United States are those who earn over $100,000 a year. In 1999, 57% of Americans who earned more than $100K a year supported trade liberalization. By 2004, that fell to 27%. And the reason it collapsed is that suddenly, talks about offshore outsourcing of not just low-level, manufacturing jobs, but, accounting positions, radiologists, IT workers. Now, if you take a look at the numbers, the effect of this has actually not been terribly great to date. The problem, though, is that trade in some ways is like crime. It's not so much that you will lose your job because of international competition. It's that you know someone who might, or you know someone who knows someone who might. And so as a result, psychologically, it's a very tough perception to break.
It's fear, and that's why one of the things that I think that we ought to do to respond, to make globalization work, to make this more receptive, is to strengthen some of our social safety nets to protect the people who are losing their jobs. So that will reduce some of that fear.
But what's interesting is that I think that implied in what you're saying is that the more that democracies pop up around the world, and the more that democracies try to express popular will, the more difficult it's going to be to actually bring some of these negotiations to a successful conclusion, because in a way, failure of Doha might be a more popular message to bring home to your people. I didn't sign on to this deal that's going to hurt all of you.
It depends on the country.
Well, yes, of course.
But I mean, I would agree to some extent. It's Joe talks about special interests, in terms of agricultural groups and so on and so forth. There's a difference between an economist and a political scientist. An economist will talk about special interests. A political scientist talks about politics as usual. So to some extent, what's going on is you're right. If Doha fails in the United States, there are going to be a lot of groups that are going to be able to claim, see, we stopped, international competition from eroding our jobs.
Balancing this, I think you have to understand, is that there are some winners.
Yeah.
And those winners realize that they're losing
by not winning.
Mm-hmm. And some of them have actually become fairly vocal more recently. The industries are like financial services that have benefited enormously say, how is it that we can let so few people in cotton or sugar stop something which is of benefit to so many Americans?
You were talking before we went on about Brazil and sugarcane and ethanol from sugarcane, and the U.S. doesn't want to know.
Yeah, this is
this at a time when we're looking for alternative sources of energy.
I mean, Brazil has succeeded in figuring out how to convert sugarcane into alcohol that can run a car. And they've used that to get energy independence, so they no longer have to import oil from the Middle East. The United States has announced that that's one of our objectives. And yet, we put a 50 cent a gallon tariff on the importation of ethanol, sugar-based ethanol from Brazil. We're hurting ourselves. We're making ourselves less secure. We're hurting Brazil, and we're showing ourselves to be hypocrites.
And the winner is?
The 20,000 Florida plantation owners who run sugar down in Florida who are protected from this.
Well, there's another group in this particular case, which is we've been pushing corn-based ethanol.
Which is far less efficient than sugarcane.
Much less. In fact, you almost have to use as much energy to make ethanol.
Corn-based ethanol.
It's corn-based ethanol as you do. And so the United States is subsidizing corn-based ethanol to about 50 cents a gallon. So this is a case where the special interest groups who make the ethanol, ADM and a few other companies, are the real beneficiaries. The taxpayers lose, and America loses because we are less secure.
Well, looking at Doha now, do you see it being revived through 2007?
No.
No, I agree. But one of the things that one has to understand is that there already have been some very important decisions by the WTO. Brazil brought a case saying that American cotton subsidies were illegal under WTO rule, and Brazil prevailed. It may be challenged, but it looks like I think it will. That Brazil is right, and I think they will prevail. The United States will probably change the legislation a little bit, and trying to keep it within the letter of the rule, but not in the spirit. They'll say that's illegal. And we'll go through this a couple of times, and in a few years' time, we will have to change our subsidies. And they'll do this, I think, they'll go from cotton to some of the other products. So in some sense, the dynamics of a rule-based international trade regime that we started in 1994, as unfair as it was, is actually bringing about some of the things that people were negotiating for in this Doha development round.
Why was it so unfair in 1994? Put that in simple terms. Who got...
Basically, what happened is that the United States in particular wanted to expand. They wanted to see liberalization in the sectors they thought they were competitive in, which were services to a large extent and agriculture to a lesser extent. Understandably, the developing countries wanted particularly to open up agriculture, certain agricultural goods, and most important, textiles.
Meaning they wanted to export to us.
Right, exactly.
We had a system of quotas that was farthest from the free trade system, specific quotas for each country, for each product.
Unbelievably inefficient. Basically, the deal that was struck at Uruguay sort of said to the developing countries, you make concessions now, and us, because of political reasons, domestic political reasons, will make concessions later. So you will agree to, liberalize your markets on services. You will agree to respect, the enforcement of intellectual property rights. And we, in 10 years' time, will get rid of textile quotas and, potentially liberalize agriculture. Well, what happened is that, to be fair, the textiles have gotten liberalized to a great extent. But, in the 10 years during the interim, a lot of developing countries discovered it's incredibly costly to enforce intellectual property rights. It raised the price of, life-saving pharmaceuticals for countries ravaged by AIDS or, malaria or tuberculosis. And so as a result, there was a perception that the situation was unfair.
And it's worse. One other thing. The United States doubled its agricultural subsidies, where the understanding was we're going to bring them down, but just give us time. Our response was double them. Europe was a little better. As Dan pointed out, their subsidies were much higher than ours, but they have brought them down a little bit.
What are we giving away if we don't have a comprehensive set of rules like the ones that we're trying to set up at Doha? How much wealth is not being created? I know it's a negative, but when you ponder that, how tragic a loss is it?
It's significant. I mean, the Institute for International Economics, again, did an estimate, about what might be gained from further trade liberalization. Now, again, this is sort of in theory, but, I mean, they went, again, upwards of, anywhere between $600 billion to over $1 trillion in extra GDP for the U.S. every year.
And I just want to add, the economics is huge.
Yeah.
But there are lots of other elements. We live in a globalized world where economics is an important part, but it's only one part. We need cooperation in lots of other areas. We are seeing that the advanced industrial countries, Europe, United States, are seen as hypocritical. If they don't grow, it hurts us. So we get hit again. It possibly is a fertile feeding ground for, terrorists, for people who have no hope, and
it touches everything then.
And immigration pressure. It puts a lot of immigration pressure. People without opportunities.
Daniel, I need to interrupt only to say the last word is yours, and you have about 15 seconds.
I would say the political effects are huge, because one of the main advantages of the WTO is, again, the idea that you had a rule-based system and that all countries, including the United States, would comply if the WTO said your rules are not in order. For example, when the U.S. imposed steel tariffs and then climbed down. If Doha collapses and if there's respect for the WTO that declines, you're going to see an erosion of the rule of law and a return to sort of power-based systems of how trade is enforced. And that's actually going to hurt the weaker countries even more.
And going back in time as well. Daniel Dresner, thanks very much for joining us. Joe Stiglitz, I'm John Donvan. Thank you for joining us with Great Decisions 2007.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.